Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Alright, Card Table Episode 4, Wild Cards Volume 3. Yeah, I sort of realized as I was doing these, I'm really doing them pretty off the cuff, obviously, so I feel like my focus is kind of changing as I go through. At some point I was thinking, oh, I should talk about the characters, but I feel like I've been a little bit inconsistent about that. So I guess we'll just see where things go as far as how much I talk about characters versus how much I talk about story versus how much I talk about the sort of maybe overall structure of each book or whatever. But like I say, if anyone thinks I'm doing it wrong, feel free to let me know. I'll try to perfect these as I go. But Volume 3 is an interesting one because it's the first one. Volume 3 is the first one to be structured as what they eventually came to call the full mosaic. Well, they've got a couple terms. Did I talk about this terminology? Braided. Sometimes they call them the braided novels, or I should say George-R.R Martin is the one who sort of, when he blogs about these or promotes them, full mosaic or braided narrative or braided novel. What they mean by that is unlike the first two books, this one and later ones that would follow, but this is the first. This book reads like a novel. It doesn't read like an anthology of short stories. Even, like I said, when I was talking about the second book, even though those short stories are almost read like chapters of a book, but they're still clearly like, here's a story by one author about one character. Here's a story about a different author about a different character. Despite the MacGuffins and the running plot lines running through, it's like, here's a story, here's another story. Whereas this one actually does read like a novel, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, but it is written by, is it 8 authors, this one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The Tor edition that I'm looking at here, about 450 pages, whereas, here's the original Bantam paperback version, doesn't crack 400, so more words per page, clearly. Here we've got the Brian Bolland illustrated original UK edition. Brian Bolland is just such a great illustrator. I do kind of like this sort of element as well. It's kind of an interesting aesthetic. Once again, like the iBooks did, they make the word wild much bigger than the word cards, which I think makes sense. Notice both Michael Comarch and Brian Bolland chose the bikini-clad character, whereas the Bantam paperbacks, they once again do this kind of, I don't know exactly what you'd call it, collage. It's maybe a little too sparse to be considered a true collage, but just different characters kind of color formed onto the backdrop. Boom, there's Sewer Jack, there's Tachyon, there's Fortunato. Turtle again, I think. Sometimes the illustrations of the turtle seem way off, don't they? I mean, because it's supposed to look like a turtle shell. It's a car originally, but it's supposed to look like a turtle shell. This one has like weird stuff. It still looks like a VW Bug. Plus, this is set in 1986 when he had abandoned the VW Bug model of shell. I mean, come on. This one is the sci-fi exclusive hardcover. This one doesn't even crack 350 pages, so this one has even more words per page. These sci-fi, they're interesting, these sci-fi club hardcovers illustrations. I don't know that they're really I guess they're intriguing enough to maybe make you want to read it, but I don't know that they really quite capture the feel, but hey, what do I know? I already did my rant about covers in the last video, so I won't rave on too much about that. Something that I've always been kind of fascinated by looking at when you consider just the art of writing fiction. We get taught that there's the different points of view that you can write from, where it's third person omniscient, third person limited, first person limited, first person omniscient, theoretically there's second person, although that's pretty unusual. And there's also, past tense versus present tense. You can switch point of view. It can be the whole story from the point of view of one character if it's third person limited. Ian Tregillis, one of the Wildcards writers, his novel, which I'll look up the name. I can't remember the actual name of the book, but it's about a missing angel, and it's done in this alternating chapters where every other chapter is first person, but it's like in that Raymond Chandler sort of noirish. She walked in, that sort of hard boiled. The night was as dark as an inkwell. Am I right about this? And then the other chapters are third person limited. Does About a Boy by Nick Hornby, does that do that as well? I feel like maybe that one also, because it alternates between the little kid's point of view and the adult guy's point of view, but I think that might also alternate between first person, or between first person and third person. And Wildcards, you'll have that too. With Wildcards, it's almost never really omniscient. I feel like the closest they might come to omniscient is some of the Vic Milan stories, where he, even though theoretically they're sort of third person limited, they sometimes that third person authorial voice gets a little opinionated when it's Vic Milan, a little knowing, where the character that we're reading about is naive. So theoretically, if it's all from his limited point of view, some of the narration should be naive. But I feel like sometimes Vic just can't help himself and gets a little, tries to get a little dig in, and maybe gets a little more sophisticated in his view than his character really would be. So it's almost always a limited POV, and the variations that we see in Wildcards are pretty much very, very typically it's third person limited. I mean, that's like the default with Wildcards. I think more common than anything else you'll see in any typical Wildcards book. First person limited is not too unusual. In the first book, The Golden Boy Story by Walter John Williams, is first person. I know Melinda Snodgrass commented a while ago, but sometime in the relaunch era, the Tor relaunch era, she was, I think it was maybe on her blog that she was talking about how it was kind of a breakthrough that she switched point of view for a character from third person to first person, and that really appealed to her, and suddenly she found that she really enjoyed writing in first person. Belinda, if you're watching, hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth. And usually past tense, just to keep things consistent. Again, the common, what you'll find in almost any piece of fiction is third past tense POV is obviously the default. I can think of a few present tense ones. Michael Cassett writing Stuntman, at least in volume 18, he writes a character called Stuntman. Well, that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. There's your English 101 for the day. I'm sure most of the people watching this are probably fiction aficionados enough such that whole summary was probably not necessary. But I mean, I'll ramble about anything. So with these books, with the braided narratives, and which again, this volume 3 being the first Wildcards to do this. So basically the clever trick is it's all third person limited. It's all consistently, one tense, past tense, like your typical novel. But it just switches point of view. So you think how does 7 authors write one book? It's just switching point of view amongst 7 different characters. So each writer has their signature POV character, and then you just go through the story, the narrative, and it just switches point of view every couple of pages, I suppose, or every 3 or 4 pages. And George-R.R. Martin, again, I don't have the iBooks version, but it's another one where in the iBooks edition, there's an afterword by him where he talks about some of the pitfalls and challenges of putting a book like this together. But they hit upon this idea of having the whole book take place over one 24-hour period. So or really 25-hour period, I guess, technically. So there's 25 chapters, and each chapter sort of starts at the start of a new hour in the day. So it starts, what is it, the first chapter? 6 a.m., and then it goes throughout, up through midnight and then 1 a.m. So you're kind of into the next day. And then the last chapter is sort of an epilogue, but I think they call it chapter 25. Chapter 25 starts at 6 a.m. the next day. So technically about 25 hours, really. And you just follow these 7 characters over the course of this very long day. It's almost like a prose version of like a season of the Kiefer Sutherland 24. I remember a friend of mine who, when that show was really popular, he was like, well, the only way to watch that show for me is I wait until the season comes out on DVD. I buy the DVD set, and then I schedule a day where I don't have to do anything else, and I just watch it over one 24-hour period. I just find my weekend that I'm totally free. I thought that's great. I love that idea. I think I had this notion that I tried it at one point. Like I gave myself a whole weekend off, and I was just like, I'm just going to read this book in real time, read a chapter every hour. I can't remember if I actually went through with that or if it was just some crazy fever dream. I feel like at one point I've reread each of these books so many times that it's hard to remember now. But I think at one point I tried that. He gave me the idea. I was like, oh, if you can do that with a TV show, I could do that with this book. But it's a good way to sort of, because now you've got a really tight sort of map, and then, a tight framework for the authors to be working in, to really keep them sort of on the same metaphorical page, where each character is just navigating through this one day. And the way it works is, generally speaking, each character in the book kind of goes on their own path. They don't intersect too often, but, well, I should say, like, no 2 characters intersect very often. But over the course of the book, there are lots of intersections among the 7, where these 2 characters might briefly, and then these 2 characters, and then the 2 from those intersections might intersect with each other. So there are actually a lot of intersections. I guess the exception to that would be Vagabond and Sewer Jack, which are the characters who are created and written by Leanne C. Harper and Edward Bryant, respectively, who co-wrote the story in the first book called Down Deep, where they pretty much did almost like I guess you could almost call that the sort of blueprint for the prototype for this one, because that was a story where it was just 2 characters, but it did switch point of view between the 2, and every time it switched point of view between the 2, it also switched authorship. So that was, but doing it with 2 characters, I'm sure it has its challenges, but it doesn't seem too complex. To do it with 7 writers and 7 characters, suddenly you're looking at a higher level of complexity. The afterword by Martin is very entertaining when he talks about some of the challenges of it. Kind of saying, like, it's harder than you might think, because it's easy enough to, when there's 7 characters, it's easy enough to lose track of one and realize, oh, we just went, 8 hours of this 24-hour day without ever checking in on character Z. Really a masterwork of editing. I definitely didn't appreciate it when I first read this as a youngin. I had no idea that this was essentially like an invention, that the authors sort of invented a new thing with this. I don't know that there was ever a novel like this before. 7 characters written by 7 authors, or that multitude again. Maybe a pair of authors, but 7, is just such an insane number of authors to try and like keep on the same path. It feels like so exhausting and exhaustive. But apparently never been done before. And yeah, when I was young, I sort of just assumed that maybe this was just something that authors did now and then. I really took for granted. I took for granted the novelty of it, the originality of it, even though even if you don't know that this is the first of its kind, it's still pretty irresistible. I mean, anyone who's read this book, I think, is impressed by just the amazing logistics of it, the way the characters thread throughout the book. Is that the right way of putting it? The way the characters and the storylines are threaded throughout the books, where each character has really their own agenda, but they keep on overlapping and creating this kind of lattice work of connections, and really a masterwork of plotting. So really entertaining on that level. I also remember I was being into Star Trek fiction at around the same time I was into Wildcards, which is not too far afield, actually, as it turns out. Both Vic Milan and Melinda Snodgrass have written Star Trek novels, both of which are very good, by the way. I've got them in the other room. Maybe I'll flash those covers on the board. But there was a book I picked up because that was credited to 4 authors. It was a Next Generation tie-in book. Doomsday World, maybe, is the name of it. Carmen Carter, Peter David, Robert Greenberger, and Michael Jan Friedman, or Michael Jan Friedman. And I sort of thought nothing of it, being familiar with these books. I was like, oh, a book with 4 authors, sure. I mean, that's not that many. It's not like it's 7 or 8. And was kind of struck by Robert Greenberger's introduction, where he basically says that Wildcards Book 3 was the inspiration for doing Doomsday World, where they were like, oh yeah, we could do that with Star Trek. We could have a novel where each of us writes one member of the crew, and then each member of the crew goes on his own adventure throughout the book. And they did it multiple times. I know Carmen Carter kind of dropped out for whatever reason, but the three dudes, Peter David Friedman and Greenberger, went on to do an original series book called The Disinherited, and a Deep Space Nine book called, I'm going to say, Wrath of the Prophets. I'm going all by memory. I don't know if it's more embarrassing to get that wrong or get it right, if I can do that all by memory. But anyway, not to get too far afield, but it's interesting that I was sort of amazed at the time, because I had no notion that there was any connection between Wildcards and Star Trek tie-in fiction at the time. And so to open that up and suddenly see Wildcards mentioned in the introduction to a Star Trek book was very was educational, was very striking. So the novelty of the structure of the book and just how well it's actually done. I mean, so the novelty of the idea and the execution of the idea are both really impressive with this book. So having established that, what's it all about? It's, if I'm recalling right, they when they sold these books to Bantam, when George-R.R. Martin sold the Wildcards concept to Bantam, Bantam bought 3 books. The contract was for 3 books that would kind of be a trilogy. They call them triads instead of trilogies. I don't remember if we've talked about that. I mean, I don't really know what the difference is, but whatever. So this is, theoretically, it's sort of a conclusion to a trilogy, which you could certainly see. The thread that continues from the first 2 books is, once again, the Fortunato thread, which I know I've talked a little bit about in the first book. Fortunato was in a pretty short story in the first book. And I can't remember if I've even talked about what Fortunato's deal was, but he's a pimp whose prostitutes are being murdered by like a serial killer. A pimp whose prostitutes are being killed by a serial killer, and Fortunato, whose powers come from having sex. Great stuff for a 13-year-old kid like me to be reading back then. 13-year-old me was maybe not ready for this stuff, but that's why I'm so screwed up now. So in the first book, there's a story where Fortunato learns that he's an ace, and that the sort of psychic trigger to activate his powers involve tantric sex rituals. And once he discovers these powers, and he ends up being one of the most superpowered characters in the Wildcards universe during these early books, tracks down the killer, but sort of reads his mind and realizes that he was maybe just a tool of some higher echelon, that there was someone pulling this guy's strings, but can't figure out who it was, because whoever that powerful person was able to kind of wipe this killer's mind and leave no clues for Fortunato to find. So that's part of the loose end that's left in the first book. And then in the second book, you find that it's connected to the Egyptian Freemasons and the swarm. And the Egyptian Freemasons are, at that point, are being led by the first major superpowered villain of the Wild Cards universe, I guess. The first big villain, the first big bad, the first final boss, if you like. The Astronomer, who becomes sort of like the arch enemy of Fortunato, if you want to. I don't know what would be a good comic book analogy, like Superman versus Zod or something, but the two really high-powered aces in the Wild Cards universe, with Fortunato being the force for good and the Astronomer being the force for evil. So the second book ends with a lot of victories for the good guys, the Swarm being defeated, the Freemasons being defeated, but the Astronomer lives to fight another day. And so the big selling point of this one was the Astronomer returns to get his revenge. And that said, what is a little surprising when one reads the book after seeing the sort of the stuff on the back, it's the Astronomer's revenge. When you actually read the book, a lot of the page count is not really dedicated to that plot at all. There's other storylines going on. The other big one involves a different story entirely. So I'm not saying they're lying when they say this is the book about the Astronomer's revenge, because that's very much a big part of the story. It's just incomplete, because there's also this story about it's the start of what would you want to call it? I guess a gang war, although it doesn't explode into all-out war, but the gang rivalry between two different sort of criminal factions in New York. It's another thing that has its seeds right in the first book, and I don't know how. I have no idea exactly how some of this stuff, how it evolves. They just recently did Marianne Mahanraj and David Levine and Walter John Williams were part of this YouTube roundtable, along with a couple of authors who wrote for a different shared world, where Mahanraj wrote for both of them. But there was a lot of Wild Cards talk, and Walter John Williams talked about how they would do like story conferences. They would get together. I can't remember if he said like once a year, once every 6 months, and just talk about different ideas. And then presumably George-R.R. Martin would be the guy would be sort of the president of, that meets with the cabinet, but then ultimately is the one who decides, all right, this is the story we're going to go with. So at some point, I have no idea how early on they made the decision, but if you look at the first book, there's the Down Deep story with Sewer, Jack, and Vagabond, where the villains of that story are the mafia. The Gambiones are sort of like the fictional family, the Wild Cards equivalent of whatever Marlon Brando's family is in The Godfather. The Gambiones are that in Wild Cards, and so that they're sort of the preeminent mafia family. And then in John Joseph Miller's Yeoman story, the character Yeoman, whose whole story involves this vendetta against a crime lord named Kien, right away you have this sort of interesting. It reminds me of in the early Marvel comics, where at some point, well, right in the very first issue of Fantastic Four, they introduced the Mole Man, who's this character who rules the world underground, and then in an issue of Hulk, same people, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, do a Hulk story where he meets the ruler of the underground, but it's a guy called Tyrannus. And then as the Marvel Universe became more of a shared world, someone, Stan Lee or Kirby or somebody, was like, you know what we could do is a storyline about how Tyrannus and the Mole Man both want to rule the underworld, and they're actually at war with each other. And then that became like a defining feature of, or one defining feature of one corner of the Marvel Universe, was that there are actually two underground rulers, and they're always kind of, you know, either a Cold War or a hot war with their two underground armies. So without any notion of exactly how the storyline evolved, I can sort of picture them going, you know, we established two different crime bosses, or two different crime organizations in the first. This is book 3. I can imagine them at a story conference being like, you know, in the very first book we established two different criminal organizations. They're in New York City, one ruled by this guy Kien, and then also just the New York Mafia, the families. Totally logical thing to do. Gang war between the two. So that becomes sort of that becomes the spine, as they put it, of Volume 5, is the big gang war between Kien's organization, which eventually gets the name Shadow Fists, versus the Mafia. And so the Mafia Shadow Fist gang war is the big sort of overarching theme of Volume 5 and the stories that are published in that volume. But they really plant the seeds here. So even though this is the last book of a trilogy, theoretically, or a triad, it's also actually kind of the start of a new triad that starts with number 3 and then ends in number 5 about this gang war. So the whole notion of kind of understanding these books as a series of arcs, you know, 1 through 3 being one arc, 4 through 7 being the next. It's probably helpful when there's so many books. It's easy, you know, to think about like, oh, maybe season 1 is these first 3 books, and then season 2 is books 4 through 7. But that does create maybe a slightly false impression of this idea that the idea of like there being like some kind of like hard line between the last book of one arc and the first book of the next, when really I feel like this book starts as many things as it concludes, which I love, by the way. That's not, I consider that a selling point, not a problem. But so really, yeah. So half the book is about the Astronomer's revenge, and then the other half of the book is about the brewing tensions between the Shadow Fists and the Mafia, and really, if you break it down kind of by numbers, you got your 7 characters. So let's have a look at each one of those. So you got Edward Bryant writing Sewer Jack, the guy who turns into an alligator. Leanne C. Harper writing Vagabond, the woman who telepathically communicates with and controls animals. And then Louis Shiner, once again, writing Fortunato. Walton Simons writing Demise, the character he introduced in the previous book, a villain who can kill you with a look. George-R.R. Martin writes from the point of view of Hiram Worcester. Hiram. Me and my friend John got me into these books originally, and he and I always said Hiram, but it's Hiram. But boy, it's really hard to make myself say Hiram, because when we were 13-year-old kids who had never seen that name before, it was Hiram. And the last name, Worcester? I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce anything. I think I said that before. I'll just butcher all the pronunciations. It's a miracle I got through my Billy Joel parody, because I didn't know how to pronounce most of the names I was saying. Hiram is the founder and proprietor of Aces High, the restaurant where aces go, the fancy restaurant near the top of the Empire State Building, where all the aces go to have fine dining. This book, I mentioned that it's set on a single day. That single day is September 15th, 1986, which is the 40th anniversary of September 15th, 1946, which is the date of the climax of that Howard Waldrop Jet Boy story, which is actually his birth date. He wanted the story to climax on literally the day he was born, which is September 15th, 1946. Oh, so the concept is that every year Aces High hosts a dinner on what's become Wildcard Day, because it's the day that the virus was first released over the skies of New York. So every year, Hiram hosts a dinner for aces at Aces High. Since this is the 40th anniversary, it's going to be a particularly huge affair. So that's sort of why Hiram becomes a very significant character, or the start of one element of his significance in this storyline has to do with the big dinner, the big wildcard dinner at Aces High. John Joseph Miller and Melinda Snodgrass. Snodgrass in the first two volumes wrote about Dr. Tachyon, and John Joseph Miller, of course, is writing about Yeoman and his ongoing vendetta. They both do a similar tactic in this book, where they write from the point of view of what really you'd probably consider a supporting character, or even maybe an antagonist in Snodgrass's case. So she writes from the point of view of a character named Roulette, and Miller creates a character called Jennifer Malloy, aka Wraith. So there's your two POV characters, but Roulette really spends the whole day with Tachyon, and it's sort of a way of looking at Tachyon from an outside perspective, rather than being in his head, inside Tachyon's head. And similar tactic going on with Wraith, where she spends quite a good portion of her day in the company of Yeoman. So it allows Miller to continue the saga of Yeoman. It's just that we're seeing his actions from not within his own head, but from the perspective of a different character. Jennifer Malloy, originally this is her debut, thanks to the retcons of the Tor re-releases, where some of the books have new stories. Now, if you read the Tor editions, the first book has a story by Carrie Vaughn. So now Jennifer Malloy is introduced right in the very first book, and so she sort of retroactively returns in this book rather than first appears. It's one of those things, I don't know if there's a good terminology. I can't think of an economical way to say all of that. This is her first appearance, but also her second appearance, depending on this, and if you consider that the first book, even though it's not, because some of it, I have no way of saying it without sounding like an idiot. So those are your 7 characters. And I realize like half of what I say is actually a digression from an unfinished thought. I said something about if you go by the numbers. What I was starting to say there was Edward Bryant's story, Edward Bryant's thread about Sewer Jack, Harper's Vagabond narrative, John Joseph Miller's story about Wraith, and Martin's story about Hiram, and Walt Simonson's story about Demise. That's 5 of the 7. All are tied up with the Shadow Fist versus the Mafia thing. So Fortunato's Revenge, obviously Lewis Shiner's Fortunato story, because it's Fortunato versus Astronomer is the big rivalry. Is all about that. Melinda Snodgrass's character Roulette actually works for the Astronomer, and has been tasked with the job of killing Tachyon, where the Astronomer has a hit list of aces who sort of foiled his scheme that involving the swarm. It's a list. I guess I could list all the aces that were involved, but there's a list of aces who foiled his scheme, and so he wants to kill everyone on that list. Tachyon's on that list, and Roulette is the one who's supposed to kill Tachyon, because the Astronomer wants to do it all in a single day, and he just doesn't have the time or the energy to get all of them. So he's sort of delegated in a couple cases. And Demise is very tied up with the Astronomer too. So Demise, I always think of Demise by Walton Simons in this book as like the MVP of the book. I feel like all these books where there's like 7 or 8 characters, I feel like you can always kind of identify the most valuable player. And in this case, I think it's definitely Demise, just because he's a great character. He's so entertaining to read about in this book, partly because he's surprisingly down to earth. In the first book, he's sort of hired by the Astronomer to be this sort of horrible hired gun, just using his ability, which is a pretty morbid sort of superpower where of just being able to kill people by looking at them. It's also established. I can't remember if it's established in the first appearance of Demise in book 2, or maybe it's in this, that he also has a healing power. So he's very hard to kill himself. Even lethal wounds administered to him will usually heal before those wounds can actually kill him. So a little bit like the classic Wolverine healing factor, but pretty extreme. One of the first things that happens in this book is he gets his head bent all the way around, like a full 180 degrees neck twist. And then Fortunato sort of sees him on the street and corrects, assumes he's dead, but just so it's a little less nauseating, twists the head back on what he thinks is the corpse. And that's enough. That's enough of a push where now Demise can kind of heal, and so he's got a pretty intense healing power. What's sort of brilliant, because he was on the part of Walton Simons, is that he turns him into this very, working class kind of down to earth guy who he's just trying to make a living, and sometimes people just piss him off, so he goes ahead and uses his murder power on them. I think it's not this. It's a later book where he just gets annoyed by a mime who won't leave him alone and kills a mime. So part of the brilliance of Demise is that you find yourself kind of relating to him, where you sort of realize, there's always those people who kind of annoy you right throughout the day, where you're like, I want to kill that guy, and he actually has the ability to just kind of do it. And then the other part is he really takes advantage of the whole healing factor element to just pile a lot of abuse on Demise, where Demise, his real name is James Spector. So James, aka Demise, aka Spector, he has so much hard luck over the course of this book. At one point, Sewer Jack, when he's in his alligator form, bites off Demise's foot. And there's the whole bit about how he sort of is slowly like trying to grow a new foot. But well, I'm not doing it justice. The point is, he just gets so much crap piled on him over the course of the book. He takes on so much damage, so much abuse, that by the end you find yourself like just wanting the guy to catch a break. It's sort of a brilliant move by Walton Simons, I always thought, like, where by the end of the book you actually are kind of sympathizing with this hired killer. Pretty fantastic. But Walton Simons and Demise, the other thing that makes him, I think, the MVP of this book is that he's the one who is involved in both storylines. So he's been hired by the Shadow Fists to deal some damage to the Mafia. So he's part of that storyline, and then he's also part of the storyline where Demise kind of catches up with him. Because like I was saying before, Demise is sort of delegating to some of these henchmen and stuff, some of this for his revenge scheme. He can't do it alone, so he's got his hired guns like Roulette, and then Demise is another one that he sort of finds at the start of the day and says, do what you need to do today. If you got this mafia, or this Shadow Fist mafia gig, go ahead, do what you need to do to make a living. But at some point during the day, I'm going to be calling on you. So it's a great. Demise really has a foot. I guess that's kind of a pun in itself, because one of his feet get cut off. But Demise really has a foot in both camp and both storylines, and he kind of straddles the line and sort of is one of the binding forces of this book, in my opinion. So I love that element of I love Demise in this book. He's really fantastic. Other characters are really more focused on one storyline or the other, even though they might cross over a little in. Like, so for example, Roulette, the ace assassin. I find myself not wanting to describe exactly what her power is, what her superpower is, she can kill people in an unconventional way. But she sort of spends the day with Tachyon, kind of having to win over his trust, because she needs to get intimate with him in order to use her power. And she also has to do it in such a way that he won't read her mind, and since he's a telepath, she can't risk him reading her intent. So she has to kind of spend the whole day kind of wheedling him and winning his trust the old-fashioned way without letting him read her mind. And so, and part of that is that the astronomer also has telepathic power, so he's kind of put telepathic shields around her mind. But even that's a little suspicious, right? If Tachyon sees that she has these shields, he gets a little. But anyway, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole describing these plot details, which probably gets a little. If you haven't read it, it's a little like, what is he talking about? But what was I going to say? So she has to spend the whole day with the guy, and at one point, even though it's all about the astronomer's revenge, there's this sort of tangent where they get a little bit involved in the whole Shadow Fist Mafia storyline. And another example is, so Hiram is trying to, Hiram's plot mainly involves one of his food suppliers who's being sort of harassed for protection money by these criminal elements, and Hiram wants to do something about that, which is how he gets involved in the whole Shadow Fist Mafia thing. But he's also organizing this dinner, and the astronomer has knowing that all these aces are going to be at this dinner, is going to launch a pretty major strike during the dinner. Meanwhile, Hiram and Fortunato are kind of assuming the exact opposite, that the dinner would be actually a place where the dinner would be a moment that the astronomer would steer clear, because there are so many aces in one place. Why would he risk showing up there? So they end up thinking that, some of the people on the astronomer's hit list should be at the dinner, because that's where they'll be safe, because they'll be surrounded by other aces. So in that sense, Hiram is involved in the Fortunato's revenge plot, but that almost feels like a little bit of a digression from Hiram's sort of main agenda in the book. Although all of these are examples of just how cool the book is in terms of those connections and the way the agenda kind of cross over between these different characters and situations. It is all very clever the way it all is put together. It's this really brilliant sort of tapestry. I think I've discussed most of the characters. I guess Hiram, I didn't mention his superpower, which is that he can control gravity, which means he can make things. Reminds me of who's the character from X-Men, Harry Leland, created by Claremont and Byrne for the Dark Phoenix saga. Whose visual is, I think John Byrne based his visual on Orson Welles, and I feel like there's a part in one of the Wildcards books where they say that Hiram looks like Orson Welles. So maybe not coincidence, because that's if that is a coincidence, it's a pretty wild one, because they both have the same power, which is to control gravity, either their own personal gravity or someone else's, so they can make a person or thing heavy, more dense, or they can make it lighter. Hiram, one of the deals with Hiram is that he's kind of constantly using that power on himself. So even though he's this kind of large, kind of girthy gourmand or whatever, he's always kind of light on his feet, as if he actually weighs, even though he looks like he weighs several hundred pounds, he only weighs maybe 50 pounds thanks to his constantly using his power on himself. I think I discussed everybody else in terms of their character and power, right? Yeah, Fortunato, yeah. Wraith is, speaking of Claremont and Byrne and the Dark Phoenix saga, Harry Leland is introduced in that story, and so is Kitty Pryde, which is the perky young lady who can phase through walls, become intangible, which is exactly what Wraith can do. I'm a big fan of Claremont's X-Men, so seeing some of these parallels, it's like, oh, no wonder I was a fan of these books too. So that's the girl in the bikini too. Is this girl who can walk through walls? I don't know if you can tell. It's not immediately clear what's actually happening, but she's actually like phasing through a wall, like trying to think. And then this one, she's not phasing through anything, but they've got the intangibility of the arm there. You get the idea, but really, it's clearly just an excuse to put a bikini girl on the cover of every book, right? There's also, I mentioned the bowling ball MacGuffin in book 2 as a way that one of the ways they kept all these disparate characters and writers were still feeling like they were all part of one narrative was by having a MacGuffin that kind of passed in from one character's hands to another. It was the bowling ball thing in book 2, the singularity shifter that everyone describes as being like a little black bowling ball. In this book, the very first thing that happens pretty much is Wraith, who uses her powers to be a thief, albeit like a Robin Hood style thief who robs from the rich and gives to the poor. She steals 2 books of stamps from Kian the crime lord, but she also steals a 3rd book, which is his diary, which conveniently has detailed accounts of every horrible crime he's ever done, written in his own hand with his own pen. Basically a big, gigantic, detailed confession that she just swipes. And of course, the Shadow Fists, working for Kian, spend the whole day trying to get that back from her. But she actually loses the books pretty early on. And at one point they pass into the hands of Sue or Jack, and then at one point into the hands of James Spector, aka Demise. And then Hiram gets them at one point. So one of the fun elements is sort of the chasing of those books. So when you read the book, it's funny to realize like that what the back of the book is telling you is just one kind of small little sliver. When such a big part of the book is this sort of like chasing the diary. Which is great, it's one of those things that creates the sense of continuity amongst these 7 characters on these 7 different paths. One of the things that makes it not, I feel it. One of the things that makes it not as convoluted as you might expect, as complex and as clever as it all is, and the way it all connects. I guess I feel like I should emphasize it's never confusing. I think maybe that's actually the big triumph. Maybe I buried the lead by waiting until I was 45 minutes into the video before saying this. But that's what's really clever about it, is that it's so clear as you're following these 7 paths. You don't find yourself going, no, wait a minute, what was the connection there? What? It's all very crystal clear. It's the way it's threaded, thanks to the clarity of the authors and I think George-R.R Martin's unsung heroics as the editor. Maybe unsung's a little melodramatic, but the editor doesn't probably get as much credit as he should, perhaps. But just the keeping it all so very clear. But I think the MacGuffin of the diary is one of the things that really helps with that, and makes it not only clear but very entertaining as you watch that book kind of fall into the hands of one character and then another. So yeah, and so over the course of the book, you have Hiram really just trying to help out a friend, his food supplier who's being threatened, or who's being kind of shook down by criminals for protection money. Jennifer, who is sort of on the run from the Shadow Fists after stealing the diary. Vagabond's story involves her friendship with the character Rosemary, who's very high up in the echelons of the. She's the is it Michael Corleone? That's the family in Godfather, Corleone. Whereas in Wild Cards it's Gambino. But Rosemary is sort of the Michael Corleone of the Wild Cards world. The one who sort of, doesn't want to be part of it and yet can't help but be drawn in. And she's friends with Vagabond, so Vagabond becomes part of the mafia milieu through her friendship with Rosemary, with Sewer Jack essentially becoming also part of it because of his friendship with Vagabond. Demise is working for the Shadow Fists, but also reluctantly being sucked back into the Astronomer's revenge scheme. Roulette wants to kill Tachyon. Fortunato wants to find the Astronomer and kill him before the Astronomer can kill others. That's all. Is that everybody? Who did I miss? Yeah, that's everybody. And yeah, and then it sort of goes over the course of 24 hours. You get to see how those different agenda intersect and cross over with each other in these very entertaining ways. I don't know where to go from there. I probably could have been more linear in all of that. Maybe describing here's the characters, here's the agenda, instead of going all over the place. I feel like maybe now would be the time to start talking about how Demise is the MVP, but instead that's buried somewhere in the middle about how much I love the Demise arc in this book. But really, a lot of these are really entertaining. I love the Hiram stuff written by George-R.R. Martin. Martin is just such a good writer, and so it seems like the character wouldn't be that entertaining because his whole deal is that he's a restaurateur. There's a bit about how he very briefly, for a hot minute back in the early 70s, he was a superhero or tried to do the superhero thing, and just didn't work out, and so he decided to just found a restaurant instead. He's not someone who really uses his powers in order to fight crime, and sort of scoffs at even the notion of doing that. And then over the course of this book finds he in this case he just sort of has to on this particular day he finds himself using his powers a lot. But there are long sections that just sort of are it's just sort of Hiram's kind of internal monologue about the delicious food that he's going to be preparing for the big meal that night. There's a great sequence where he's just looking at the ice sculptures that have been sculpted for the occasion. I remember reading. I haven't checked out those Ice and Fire books yet, those Game of Thrones books, but apparently some people are big fans. But I did read a review where someone was very struck by how they weren't expecting when they finally read Game of Thrones how many passages would be dedicated to describing meals. I haven't read the books myself, so I don't know exactly which sequences he's talking about, but wasn't as surprised as this critic was. I think the critic assumed it was all going to be violence and sex, and sort of fan service, like what you'd expect from a typical fantasy genre book. And he was like, oh, they're actually like these beautiful descriptions of the food. And I sort of thought, if you'd read Wild Cards Book 3, you probably wouldn't be so surprised, because Hiram's sequences in the book have that sort of charming quality. A lot of bits about him wondering what to serve, thinking about what he might serve. Again, talking about the ice sculptures, and then during the actual meal itself, we get to hear Hiram's review of what his cooks have, what his chef has prepared, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of loving descriptions of food in the book that really that are very fun to read. It's one of those funny things, just like the guy who read this fantasy novel and found himself charmed by the descriptions of food of all things. Here's a book about superheroes and superhumans, fighting each other with all these cool powers. And some of the best written passages in the book are just about the meal, the meal that they eat in between. So fun stuff. The Hiram Worcester section also introduces another creation of George-R.R. Martin named J. Ackroyd, the private investigator, the preeminent PI, not really the only private investigator in the Wild Cards universe, but the quintessentially perfect one, whose ability has a great superpower where he can kind of almost like Demise, but much more benign. Where Demise has to, if someone's annoying him, he can just kill him with a look. J. Ackroyd, not quite so lethal, but anyone who's bothering him, he can just go and they vanish to wherever Jay might imagine. So he can teleport them to Yankee Stadium or whatever, or if it's a criminal, he can just teleport them into a jail cell. Great power and just a great character. Wisecracking PI who is actually funny. I think George-R.R. Martin just really demonstrates what a wit he is with some of the sequences between Hiram and Jay Aykroyd in this book, with Hiram being kind of the straight man to they really become like a great comedy duo, with Hiram being this sort of upper class, has this kind of upper class kind of pomposity to him, and Jay Aykroyd being kind of the down to earth blue collar guy who kind of is constantly kind of piercing Hiram's pretensions, which is always very fun. Very fun dynamic, and Jay Aykroyd, I think, goes on to become a real fan favorite amongst Wild Cards readers, rightly so. So that's another cool element of this book. It's the first appearance of Jay Aykroyd. And what else is there to say? It does sort of definitively end what you could call the Astronomer triad, even though the Astronomer actually isn't in the first book. He's just sort of, his existence is just sort of hinted at in the first book. In the second book, as you'll see, as I talked about a lot in that video, the Astronomer is the head of the Egyptian Freemasons, but there's also some Takesian villains. There's the Swarm. So it's not like it's just all Astronomer all the time. And this book is the same thing. The Astronomer is the big bad, but so are the Shadow. So is there are other big bads in this. We meet Kian's. I guess he wouldn't quite be the second in command, but high up in the Shadowfist hierarchy is a character named Sinjin Latham, whose wildcard name is Loophole, even though they kind of imply that he's not actually a wildcard. But he still has. There are some humans in wildcards who don't have powers, but they still get their own sort of handle or nickname. So he's a lawyer, Sinjin Latham, aka Loophole, who's Kian's lawyer, sort of the Shadowfist's legal representation, but also up to it in terms of corruption. He's right, up to it. What am I trying to say? In terms of the corruption of the Shadowfists, he's involved. He's in it up to his neck. There's the phrase. He's got some great scenes too. I love Lupo. I think he's a really great character in the series. One of the great villains. He gets a lot of screen time in this one. So yeah, it's a cool book. The structure of it is just so remarkable. It's sort of amazing that these 7 writers. There's a great bit in the George-R.R. Martin afterword where he talks about how one of the reviews talked about how one of the reviews credited Martin with editing the writers' voices so that it reads as if it's all written by one single author. That there isn't like a huge disconnect between one authorial voice and another. And Martin says that he was bemused by that because he actually didn't edit for style at all. He didn't edit their voices. All of his editing had to do with logistics and plot and story. So it's a good example of like how critics just kind of see stuff and make up things, their own sort of concepts of what went into the creation of the book. I do that myself when I read these Wild Cards books. I sort of think, oh, I'll bet what happened was they were talking about this, and that's what sparked the idea for this. When of course I have no idea. But that said, I can see where the critic made the mistake because it does read really smoothly. I think when you read it more than once, or in my case, when you've read it, I don't know, 10 times. I'm not sure how many times. You can certainly see, like, okay, this writer tends to do this versus, writer A kind of, their style leans in this direction, and writer B, their style kind of goes more like this. You can definitely see it. One of the kind of cool things with these books is that it it always can kind of be justified by the fact that you're also switching point of view and you're going into a different character's head. So, so of course, it's going to, quote unquote, sound different inside one character's head versus another. So, I think that's one of the reasons why some of the stylistic ticks or the elements of one writer's style versus another never jar, because as Martin said, it's not like he edited the style in order to do that. It just happened that way. And I think the reason the styles don't jar is because you're also switching from one character to another. If it was just one character, and a different writer was I'm going to write chapter 2 and then another writer is going to write chapter 3, but it's always going to be inside the same character's head, I think right away you'd notice, you'd be like, oh, suddenly it seems a little, why is the character now thinking, whatever it is, like so much more poetically or whatever, like why are his thoughts suddenly so much more eloquent or something like that. But yeah, because it switches character too, it's like a potential problem that solves itself, which is kind of a nifty thing, probably something that couldn't really be predicted when they were putting the book together, but something that just kind of works out really beautifully when you actually read the finished product. This sort of notion that, this sort of sense of, if anything, it just reads really perfectly. It's like, because if you go the other direction and say, what if it was just one writer writing all 7 characters, it might start to get a bit samey, depending on the skill of the actual writer, of course. But I'm not trying to impugn any of these actual people, but you can imagine like a hypothetical writer switching point of view amongst 7 different people, that those 7 people might not necessarily be as distinct from each other as they could be. But when it's 7 fictional people being written by 7 actual people, of course it sounds a little different each time, every time it switches from one guy to another. I'm probably belaboring the point, but you see what I'm saying, right? Like, it's just a cool sort of thing, that like a potential problem that in actuality becomes a huge plus, which is really pretty nifty. So yeah, that's one element of this book that I think is really cool. Of all the quote unquote braided books, it's just a quality of those books that's really striking and unique to Wildcards, or at least was unique until other people maybe tried to copy them, but original to Wildcards. Love that about the book. It is, I guess, the caveat for people who are like, oh, the first 3 books are one trilogy, so I'm just going to read those first 3 books. I guess buyer beware, because actually, even though it resolves the Astronomer stuff, it creates a whole new. It starts a whole other plot line with the gang wars that doesn't really get concluded really until volume 5, and the whole Shadow Fist Mafia thing. I would argue that if you were really looking for something less demanding, again, I think I mentioned it last time, stop after book 2, because book 2 actually feels a little more complete, where you get a real sense of resolution of book 2 with really not too much of a sense of loose ends, even though the Astronomer gets away at the end of that one. Ironically, I feel like the second book in the Putative trilogy feels more like the end than this one does, because even though this one ties off the Astronomer stuff, it introduces a bunch of new characters, new conflicts. But of course, if you're interested in the saga as a whole, then again, that's a huge plus. It's one of the things that makes the books so addictive, because you get to the end of one story arc, and already other story arcs are brewing. Again, big parallel in like Claremont's X-Men. So it's not just that you've got some people with similar powers and the coincidence of characters who apparently look like Orson Welles, but it also that sort of soap operatic quality of there's always something maybe being concluded, just as something else is starting, and also at the same time there's something that's still kind of in the middle, that we're in the middle of, which is I personally find it incredibly addictive. I think a lot of other Wild Cards fans would agree. But yeah, be warned that if you move, if you read the first two books and loved them, if you move on to this one, you might find yourself going, oh well, now I have to read the next one because I have to find out what's going on with the Shadow Fist Mafia stuff. I guess that's probably enough to say about this book. I realize I've been talking for a good hour here. Next time we'll look at book. I talk myself hoarse during these things. That I feel like that's a good sign in the sense of my own interests. Whether it's pleasant to listen to my creaky voice by the end is maybe another question. But I apologize if my scratchy voice has become incredibly unpleasant. So next time will be episode 5 of Card Table, and we'll look at volume 4 of the series, Aces Abroad. So hope you'll watch that one. Thank you for watching this one, and talk to you later. And as always, leave comments if there's some if I left out what you consider the most amazing, wonderful thing about volume 3, and you're shouting at the screen, going, "How could you talk about volume 3 of Wild Cards and not mention blank?" Put it in the comments. I know that's how I am when I watch these YouTube videos. Like, they didn't even talk about the best thing about the thing. So feel free to write that in the comments, and I can maybe bring it up in a future video or whatever. So, all right. So thanks again. I'll see you next time.
Doesn't have any class. She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George-R.R. Martin. His characters have so much pop. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."